Hi everyone, it's Kurt again here for another video. Today we're going to be talking about creating interaction in the classroom. All right, so let's jump right in. Okay, so before we start talking about more practical ways of promoting interaction in your classroom, we always want to try to make a connection to research. And in this case, we're talking about research on second language acquisition. So what we know is that interaction is enhanced by automaticity. Remember, we learned about automaticity before, and that way, or in that way, we also need to focus on promoting our students' ability to produce language without thinking or translating too much. So the two kind of go hand in hand. We know that engagement with others in speech acts of fulfillment leads to competence in the language that develops a system of intrinsically motivated self-reward. So the more that you use language for real functions or purposes and you're successful, that will increase students' motivation, and that's a reward in itself, intrinsic reward. Okay, we know that interaction requires self-regulated strategies. So as students are forced to interact, they need to come up with their own strategies in order to succeed. It's what we want. Remember, that's one of the major parts of communicative competence, is having these type of strategies. Interaction requires an investment in learning, and it requires an identity. So if the student doesn't want to learn, they hate English, then it's really hard to get them to interact. And so you need to really try to deal with these situations where they don't want to learn English or they don't have an investment in getting better. You'll get the one-word answers and things like that. We know that cultural components of interaction require cultural competence, and we also know that interaction leads to learner agency, students becoming in control of their own learning, not just dominated by the teacher telling them how to do it. Okay, so who are interactive teachers? They are teachers who are aware of their classroom dynamics, and the success depends on how students relate to each other, the classroom environment, effective communication, cooperation between students, and then, of course, what are the teacher's roles and what are the student roles. And I can't stress enough how important those first three are, in that if the students do not get along and you've created too much competition, or you don't deal with these issues where they don't like each other or they don't want to work together, if you don't deal with that in the beginning, it'd be really hard to get them to work together for anything, because there's an environment of distrust and dislike. And so you need to deal with that stuff in the very beginning, and that really starts with the teacher. Okay, so now looking at the roles of the teacher, there are many different hats that a teacher can wear. And if you brainstormed for a minute, you could come up with so many, like actor, babysitter, nurse, doctor, salesperson, marketing strategist. You could go on and on and on. You're not just a teacher. But when we talk about the role in the classroom, we can break it down into 5 major roles. So on the left-hand side, you can see you can be the controller. You are in control of everything. What they do, what they learn, how they study, the way the input is given to the students, the output that they give out. And then we can slowly move, like we have a director. So a director could be, the director of a movie. You're still in control, even though there may be some individual differences from your actors or your students. And then we have the manager, the person who kind of sets it up, but the students in class have a little bit more say in what they do and how they do it. And then we move all the way down to facilitator. You're there to help, but in the end, the students take more of an active role. And at the very far end, we have you are a resource, where basically students come to you when they need you. But other than that, they are in control of their own learning. So if you want to have an interactive classroom, you have to be at that far end over in the facilitator and resource area. If you are the controller, this is your typical teacher-dominated classroom. Students cannot be in control on their own, and they will not need to interact because you are the one giving them all of the information. Okay, so this is important. Okay, so who are interactive students? They are students who capitalize on their personality traits. They maximize the good ones that help, and they minimize the ones that don't. And as a teacher, you may need to help them find those traits that are worthwhile and how to ignore the ones that maybe aren't as valuable to them. Okay, the next section I want to talk about is questions. So we know that in the classroom, questions are a good thing, and we want students to, activate their cognition. And we also want questions to lead to good interaction. But there are many types of questions. Some are good and some are bad when we're looking at creating an interactive classroom. So I'd like to go through a few different types and then share a little research with you. So what we know is that in an EFL or ESL or ELF classroom, however you want to define yours, interaction usually is less when we're using a second or a foreign language. So you think about it, maybe in your Chinese class, students will easily interact with each other, but when the teacher makes them use English, maybe they hold back a little bit. They don't really want to get involved. Now in bilingual classrooms, like I said, or this type of English learning as a foreign or second language, we know that questions can promote interaction. And we know that there are many benefits. First of all, it's useful to check their understanding, right? Did they understand the material that you are presenting to them? It helps them to practice and check their understanding, which leads to higher self-esteem. Maybe I think I know the answer, but I don't get the chance to actually say it out loud or write it down. And if you ask me a question and I'm able to answer you and I do it correctly, well, that makes me feel pretty good about myself. If I get it wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing because now the teacher is going to guide me to the correct answer. It can promote learning through scaffolding, so that could be from classmates or from teachers. And it also helps students to verbalize their thoughts and in turn clarify their minds. So sometimes we've got a lot of thoughts flying around inside of our brains and we're not really sure what it all means until you say it out loud or write it down in a paragraph, and all of a sudden you start to clarify. Okay, we know that quality interaction is necessary. If we want to say we have an interactive classroom, it can't just be the teacher asks you a question and the student gives a one-word answer. That's not quality interaction. So one way is to do the extended initiation response feedback sequence. We can use a wide variety of teacher language functions, so purposes for using the language. We want teacher questions that require high-level cognitive responses rather than low-level demonstrations of knowledge already shared. We want long student turns instead of short ones to allow them to express these higher-level concepts. So that's what I talked about before. Do you like this? Yes. What color is it? Blue. Past tense or present tense? Past tense. Just very simple answers. They're not really activating the student's cognition. And another important one down below, and then I'll probably repeat this a few times, you need to give students enough time to process what you've said. Maybe they need to translate it a little bit, and that way they can come up with an answer. I've seen this happen in classrooms many, many, many times where teachers ask a student a question and they give them about 1 second to answer. And then maybe the teacher is really nice. They don't want the student to struggle or feel bad, so they quickly move on to the next one. But you should never do that because maybe that student really has the answer. They're just building up their courage, or they're processing a little bit, or they're making sure they really understood the question before they respond. And so if you immediately go away and ask another student, or you immediately give the student the answer instead of letting them come up with it, what you're doing is you're telling them one of two things, in my opinion. First is, you're not good enough, or you don't know the answer, you're not smart enough, so here, let me do it for you. Or you're telling the student that every time I ask a question, don't worry, you don't need to answer because I'm going to jump in and answer it for you anyways. So both ways, you're not going to promote interaction. Now, of course, if the student is about to cry and you can tell they're very uncomfortable, but they don't want to tell you they don't know the answer or they're really struggling, then that's the time you say, you know what, that's okay. You think about it and I'll come back to you later. Something like that. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the different types of questions that could be used in the classroom. Now, I'll try to go through these quickly. We can talk about them later in class if you have any more specific questions. So the first one is a rhetorical question. This is where no answer is expected. So there's an example there. Beautiful day today, isn't it? You're not going to say, yes, it is. No, it isn't. All right. The second is a self-answered question. And this is when the teacher answers their own question. So maybe I walk in and say, okay, what does CLT stand for? Yep, communicative language teaching. Okay, number 3, display questions. These are questions in which the teacher already knows the answer, but they're only asking to assess what the students know. So maybe I walk into class and I say, okay, everyone, what does CLT stand for? Communicative, and then the student says language teaching. I say, yes, that's right. So when I asked the question, I already knew the answer that I was asking. I just wanted to test the student. Okay, number 4, we have referential questions, and there are 2 types of referential questions. So by definition, a referential question means these are answers that are not known by the teacher. So they are genuine questions. Now there are 2 types. We have what's called divergent and convergent. So a divergent referential question is more open-ended, and this will require more of a complex answer by the student. Convergent is much simpler answer and maybe just 1 or 2 words, and probably the student will not be able to really expand upon the answer. So you can see the 2 examples I have there. The divergent one is, what do you think about bilingual education? Wow, this is a very big question, and it will take someone a lot to actually come up with a satisfactory answer. Now, convergent, of course, what days do you teach your new EMI course? Or what days do you have speaking and listening class? Oh, Mondays, that's it. So even though I don't know the answer, the person who is responding cannot give me a very deep answer in convergent. Okay, number 5 is confirmation checks. So these are used to determine if students understand or not. Do you understand? Okay, got it. Typically, these are not even really questions, right? Like if you ask your students, do you understand? They rarely will say, no, I don't understand. It's always, mm-hmm. So not a real question. Maybe just teachers use them sometimes. Okay, number 6, clarification requests. They are used to clarify what the student said. So for example, sorry, could you please repeat that? Number 7, we have indirect questions. So here a response is not expected as the teacher is giving an example or pretending to be another person asking a question. So for example, the teacher is talking and they want to pretend they're someone else. They will say, okay, should I start using TBT? I'm asking a question pretending to be somebody else. Okay, next one is repeat questions. So the teacher repeats the last word or utterance of the student. Student says, I like this game. Teacher says, oh, you like this game? Okay, repeat question. Next is a retrospective question. The teacher refers to something they've already discussed or experienced or learned. So teacher says, remember when we talked about translanguaging? Students say yes or no or something like that. And indirect requests. So the teacher implies a request through a question. Can you help me open the window? Something like that. All right. So 10 different types of questions. Now, before I move on to the next part where I share some research with you, I want you to think about, what do you think is the best type of question for creating interaction in the classroom, and which are probably questions that you should leave alone because they're not really going to promote interaction in your classroom. Okay, so here I go. If you want to think about that more deeply, you should pause your video before you look at the next slide. Okay, so this is a study. Now, just to say a couple things here. In this particular study, it was done on college professors in Spain. They're EMI professors, so they're teaching some subject using English. They come from a few different colleges, I believe. And what they studied was what question types were the most used by the professors. So you can see here, we've got display questions, 55%. So that's when I already know the answer and I ask you a question. And then we got convergent referential. So I don't know the answer, but remember it's convergent, which means the student cannot really give a deep answer. It's usually just a few words. Confirmation checks, 9%. Self-answered questions, 8%. And finally, down here, we have divergent referential questions. So while you were thinking about it, which type should be the best for creating interaction in the classroom, you can see divergent referential questions down here at only 4%. 4% of the questions used. So even though we think maybe we're asking our students a lot of questions, but they're still not interacting, they don't want to participate, it could very simply be the type of questions that you're using. You're not engaging them, you're not activating their cognition. Okay, so let's move on. How can you discourage interaction in the classroom? So see, first point, too much time on display questions. And we saw from the research that that is a real thing that can happen. Second one is you use questions that insult their intelligence. You have to be really careful with junior high school students about this one. When you ask them vague questions, you have to be careful with the language that you use when you're asking questions. If your question is vague or the language is too long or complex, it's not that they don't want to answer, it's that they're not really sure what you're asking. And so they don't want to embarrass themselves by answering something that's totally different than what you're asking. So I had to be really careful, the language. Simpler is better. And when you ask your question, if you get confused looks, then you know there's something wrong with the question you're asking. So find a better way to say it. Don't translate to Chinese. Try a better way to say it. Try not to use rhetorical questions too often, and try not to use random questions that don't really connect to what you're asking or what you're teaching. Because if sometimes you answer your own question, sometimes it's not a real question, sometimes you're just asking something with no meaning, the students will get confused and they'll not be sure, when should I answer, when should I be quiet? And so it's better to try to use the better types. That way you can create this kind of more interactive room. Okay, so how can you promote interaction? Use a lot of parent group work. Give commands and directions that lead towards students doing something interactively. Use organizational language that they can understand. React to your students. Respond to them genuinely. Encourage them to develop strategies and follow every instruction, like any kind of teaching you do, with some kind of task that allows them to interact with each other while practicing the material that you just taught them. Okay, so speaking of pair work and group work, there are some who have issues or are scared to use it because of certain, well, we'll call them myths, even though they're not all myths, but they're things that you have to deal with. So the first one is that the teacher's not in control of the class. Remember, we are not when we look at the teacher role, we don't want you to be the controller. We want you to be a facilitator or a resource. So it's okay, put them into groups. Now it's their turn to be in control. Students will use their L1. Yes, they will use Chinese to talk to each other sometimes. They're still gonna have to focus on English if you give them a reason to. So the task that you give them has to have some kind of English output involved. So they will have to work together, they will focus on the language, and then if you tell them at the end you need to present your final, whatever it is you asked them to do, the final content, the final output, you need to use English. And then they will practice because you will give them a score, or they will have to get assessed by their classmates. So as long as you give them a reason to focus on the language, then they will. Now, if it's a speaking class and you just want them to practice speaking English, then there are ways you can do it. Everyone has their own strategy, but for me, I would just threaten my students and say, okay, if anyone's speaking Chinese while this English practice time is going on, I will sit down in your group and you have to practice with me. Or even worse, you have to come to the front and stand with me and practice together. And so they will be a little afraid. And then you just walk around the classroom and, you stick your ear out, I'm listening to you. And that way, most of them will still use English to practice. Okay, the third one is that students' errors will be reinforced in small groups. This one is something that you shouldn't really worry about. Students get a lot of chance to practice. They get you as the input. They listen to the teacher. Mistakes are part of learning, and they're not just gonna, I made a mistake, so now my partner is gonna make the same mistake, and then eventually everyone in the class will make the same mistake. It doesn't work that way. Number 4, teachers cannot monitor all groups at once. That's okay. Same thing. You are not the controller. This is their time. And in their time, they want to practice on their own without you watching everybody. Now, of course, you should be walking around and listening. You'll hear a lot. They don't think that you can hear them, but you can. And so you're still kind of monitoring them, but not so specifically. Remember, this is their time, not your time. Some learners prefer to work alone. That's true, but that's why you need to have a balance. Sometimes it's individual, sometimes it's group work. And it's a real part of life where we have to work together with other people. And then diverse student learning styles complicate group work. They can, or they can benefit. So, you have to know your students, different types of styles, and maybe you can use that to your advantage, where maybe one student is a better listener than the others. And so their job is going to be to listen and take the instructions down. Someone else might be better at hands-on. So that student can get the job where they need to use their hands. Make it work for you. Okay. The next part about having interaction in your classroom is creating an English environment. You have to. It starts with you. You have to use English with them. If you speak Chinese all the time, they're going to speak Chinese all the time. If you use English all the time, they will speak Chinese in the beginning, but they will slowly start to use more and more English the more that you show this is an English environment. So some things you can do is stress the importance of practice, of using English. Why do you care? Why should I improve my English? So appeal to their motivational factors, like why will they need English in the future? How can that benefit them? Show enthusiasm. You have to be enthusiastic about their English learning. Remind them how safe their groups are. When you're in a group, only your group members can hear you using English. It's the perfect chance to speak English without being judged by everybody. And remind them that actually the more you use English in class speaking, that will help you on your tests because you will start to learn where your mistakes are. Okay. And that's it for this one. So thank you everybody for your attention as always, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.